Welcome to PRUFROCK'S Poetry House. My name is Alex M. Frankel, and I'm a poet from the quiet, poetic hinterlands near El Sereno and Highland Park in the beautiful northeast corner of Los Angeles. My guest today is poet Jane Zwart. Jane's poems have appeared in Poetry, Plowshares, and Threepenny Review, as well as other journals and magazines. She also reviews books, writes the occasional essay, and interviews other writers. Her first collection of poems will be published in the fall of 2025 by Orison Books. She teaches literature and writing at Calvin University, where she also co-directs the Calvin Center for Faith and Writing.
Memento Vivere. My husband tells me I should write about life, about the garden he's planted, the celosia topped with felted flames, the chenille full of Muppets' pink fingers. And it is not negligible, the life, the marigolds crowding the touch-me-nots, the squash blossoms like nylon try-on socks stashed in a plant we did not mean to buy. If it must be life, let me also mention the cardinal. He is gargling song at the top of a dogwood that my husband stands under, an orb of waning geranium plucked and balled in his hand. And I, who have told many half-truths, say, but I always write about life.
Welcome, Jane Zwart.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on this broadcast. It's really a privilege to have you. I've been enjoying your work online, and now I get to talk to you sort of in person about your poems. One thing that I'm really glad to know is that you will be having a collection at the end of this year. I had to search around. Fortunately, your website is very organized, but I had to search around to go to many different places, and imagine I was not connected to the web or to the cloud. I wouldn't be able to read any of them. So now we will be able to have them in a slim volume of poetry.
Yeah, thank you so much.
How many pages will it be about? Between 80 and 90, do you think?
Yeah, I think it'll be about 80 pages. It's hard to know because the formatting will shift around and so on, but that sounds about right.
Oh. Now, you have to get blurbs for that book. Is that right, too? It's important to get blurbs?
I hear that it is. This is my first go, so there are all sorts of things that I'm sure I'll be learning along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, blurbs are an art in themselves, aren't they? Especially poetry blurbs. You can't just say, oh, this is good, like Hemingway. Oh, this is good. I have a good feeling about this book. You have to almost write a poem as a blurb, you know?
Yeah.
These are some craft conversations I like to have. But one thing that strikes me is the vast majority of them are written in the first person, I, or at least me. You do have one that is called A Poem Without Myself in It. But for the most part, the I is there. And I'm wondering, these are not really, you couldn't call them confessional poems, but the I is there. And it's not just you. There's a trend, and it's been going on for a long time. And to this day, what do you gain from writing in the first person, especially the I, that you might lose with a he or she?
That's a really good question. I think for me, a lot of the time, the speaker of the poem, as people call it, is more or less me, myself. Not always, but I think that makes it comfortable for me to slip into the first person. But I also feel like one of the things that being in the first person lets me do is connect more to the you of the reader. And so I feel like I want these poems, as much as they can be, to be bridges, right? And so from wherever I happen to be, either inside the poem or adjacent to the poem, if I've done a little fictionalizing, I want to be able to somehow imagine the reader or the listener on the other side and approach them as just myself or a version of myself and reach them as just themselves.
That's really interesting. Well, this is related to that. And I know this may sound like a scandalous question, but when you write a poem, do you ever think of business decisions? Like, are you afraid to write a very long poem because, oh no, long poems are not popular? they're harder to place. Do you ever make that a kind of a business decision, or is that completely anathema?
I don't make business decisions while I'm writing, I don't
Uh-huh.
think. I hope I don't make them even when I'm revising or
Mhm.
editing, but I for sure make them when I decide what to send where,
Oh,
right? And so if I know that a magazine is more tolerant of things that rhyme, I might see if
mhm.
I have some things that rhyme. I don't have very many,
Yes.
I only have a couple.
Yes.
Or if they seem to really like narrative poetry, I try and find a poem that tells a little bit of a story. So,
Mhm.
those things are part of getting things where they might have homes or hospitable audiences, but I try to save it for after the writing part
I see.
and put it in the sending part.
I see. I see. Well, now that I brought up the term business, what about this thing called the biz or the poetry business? I mean, there are a lot of people who just end up writing in their basements and the years go by and they never get into the business. And I guess it is a business in a certain sense. I don't have any specific question attached to that except how do you fit in? How do you deal with the biz?
Yeah, I mean, it's for sure not a lucrative business, right? So there's that. I think for me, I think about it more along the lines of just finding community and finding other people that are trying to do creative and interesting things with language and image and sound. And so there is a business side to all of it. That's why we all, when we send out manuscripts, pay a reading fee.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
because not enough people buy poetry. So there is
Yes.
that business end to it. And for a while, sometimes a long time, it was a long time for me. Your consolation is you're supporting something that you think is important, even though it's not your turn yet. And so I
Mm.
think when it comes to writing poems and sending poems and publishing them, when it comes to writing reviews, what I want more than sort of to make the business go or be a POBIZ success is I want to feel like I am part of a community of people who are careful with language and who know that words have weight and that they
Mm.
also have lightness and room for play. So I think I'm looking for the people more than I'm looking for the sort of business in a large
Mm.
sense.
Yes. And related to that is the whole question of audience. We like in pop culture or even people who read novels. Your uncle reads novels, your aunt reads novels,
Mhm.
and they don't necessarily aspire to write them. But are you ever troubled by the notion that most, if not all, of the readers are going to be fellow poets? That there's not such a clear distinction between
Mhm.
the virtuoso sitting at the piano and the great masses out there who are listening appreciatively, but who may not play an instrument themselves, who are just like music lovers. And that doesn't seem to happen so much nowadays, especially maybe in the 1400s, but it doesn't happen nowadays. Are you ever troubled? I mean, I am, so I shouldn't assume that you are, but how do you navigate that of not having an audience or, God forbid, a fan base the same way a novelist might have?
I think there's a couple of things that I would say about that. And one is that I am troubled that more people do not spend time with poetry. I'm not troubled, but I'm at least sort of kindled when my students say that they don't understand poetry and they don't read poetry. And I think part of what I hope that I have small chances to do is to make people understand that, like any other form of writing, poetry is made up of words and it's
Mm.
strung together and there are human things going on in it and that a lot of it, if you don't sort of freak yourself out about it too much, is a lot more accessible than people think. But the other part is, I guess, I feel like, yeah, working in poetry isn't like being a superstar or a diva for hardly
Mm.
anybody, but it's
Mhm.
like being in a choir. And I
Mhm.
actually would really rather be in a choir. The sort of way that you have this fellow feeling and there are differences in all our voices. So, not a
Mhm.
choir where everyone's trying to sound very neatly the same, but sort of a rowdy, messy voiced choir
Uh,
where we love the music and
yes.
it's not something that we all perform identically, but it's
Mhm.
something that we're involved in together.
Yes. Yes. I think that's a very good answer. Related to that, you, like me, are a Christian, and so I guess you've already more than partly answered this question, but artists are egomaniacs. And you just used the word diva. And I don't think the Bible has good things to say about egomaniacs and divas and ambition. It talks about living somewhat anonymously and being of service to others. And it's not me, me, me. I mean, that's really a big part of it, the lack of focus on me and the focus on others. So I guess you've partly answered, but maybe now more from the Christian perspective. Do you ever have difficulties with controlling your ego and trying to get into a more humble mindset? Are you ever tempted by the world and its obsession with celebrity and with the self, where it's all about the self? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I don't think there's probably hardly anyone who never is, and especially anyone who is trying to do something for an audience, whether it's a small
Mm,
audience or a bigger audience. So, yeah, of course, there is a part of me that really appreciates it when someone notices what I'm doing. And when I feel seen or when something that I've worked to craft is admired,
mhm,
that is obviously something that feels really good. And I don't want to make light of that. But I also think that it's true that one of the hopes that I have is that I keep coming back to a sort of bigger why than that in my writing. Maybe because it's what I do in my reading, right?
mm,
Because one of the things that I feel like literature, that art actually, sort of in general, allows us to do is to feel less lonely in
mhm,
significant ways. And I feel like for me, poetry has been a provision for feeling less lost or strange than I would otherwise.
mhm,
And I want it to be that for other people. And if some of my poems can be that for other people, how lovely would that be?
mhm,
I think one of the things that poems do is remind us how strange things are and to slow down
mhm,
and notice their oddity and their
mhm,
intricacy. And I think for me, speaking as a Christian, that is part of honoring creation and thereby honoring the God who created all of
mhm,
us and all of it, that there's kind of a reverence there. And there's something like a hymn in a lot of poems, right? That underneath is probably praise. I hope it's
mm,
praise.
mm. Well, very interesting. Very good answer. Speaking of poems, how about reading another one? I think the next one we thought about was Go Back to Your Own Country. That's kind of relevant for our time.
Good. So, yeah, this one, the title was given to me as a prompt. I don't think I would have been brave enough to write it otherwise. So, my poetry buddy, Amit Majmudar, gave me this
Mhm.
title as a prompt. So, it's
Mm,
called Go Back to Your Own Country. Let me tell you about countries. Nobody has their own. And where we come from moves. Our mother's wombs aren't where we left them. Continents calve. Jerusalem holds a tray full of glasses that a scrum of men take and put back, unworried for the weight she must shift. Let me tell you, some of our countries aren't where we left them. Someone pulls a string and six tumble from Yugoslavia's pocket. Someone halves Sudan like a branch over their knee. Someone crumbles a Bailey between Berlins, and Germany is one place again. Only Adam had his own country, and he could not go back. A country is land that's learned to disown.
I love that one. Thank you for
Thank
reading
you.
it. Now, in the first one you read, there was reference to your husband. I guess one could say that there is a kind of a character in there. In the second one, well, you mentioned Adam, so I guess he could be considered a character, but for the most part, it looks like a characterless poem. Would you like to talk a little bit about characters, the concept of characters in your own poems? Because I've read many of them now, and it doesn't strike me like it doesn't hit me over the head that they're all these characters. They seem relatively ghostly to me. But that's not just in your poems. In most poems that I read, even though there's maybe a name or a you or a he, yeah, I don't see characters except in something like My Last Duchess, like we were talking
Mhm.
about the other day, where it's definitely character. You couldn't imagine that without a character. Yet, I think in interviews you have talked about characters a little in your poems. A friend of mine calls them figures. It might be a better word some of the time. Would you like to say something about characters in your own poems?
Yeah, I think that many times figures probably is a better word, but I think partly that ghostliness or that sort of incompletion, it's there in the poem because the poem isn't a short story
Mm.
or a memoir or a novel, right?
Mhm.
So that sort of fullness is something that I think just the density and brevity of the poem kind of creates. But at the same time, the people in my poems, almost all of them, when I see them, do seem to me like characters.
Yeah.
They seem to me like people who have all sorts of ties to other people and motives and things going on, of course, and this is good. My husband seems like a whole person to me, the kind of person that you could write a whole book about. But I'm not a person who has figured out how to write a whole book. So
Mhm.
instead, he appears in a poem. But yeah, I think a lot of the people who come into my poems just very briefly and
Mhm.
aren't sort of full in the poems are still full in my life, right?
Mm.
There's the girl I see
Yes.
on the treadmill next to me who's not running and is just plugged into the TV and is sitting there eating Cheetos in the middle
Mm.
of a gym where everyone else is working out,
Mm.
right? I mean, that's a character. That is a whole
Yes.
person. And so I think I might be naming who they are outside the poem instead of who they are inside the poem.
Hmm. Well, that's very interesting. That's a very good answer. And may I ask some of your influences, either when you first started or now? Maybe that's changed since first starting and now. Some of the influences then and now?
Yeah, I am so grateful to have grown up in the house of two people who trained to be English teachers because there
Mm.
were a lot of poems and a lot of other books too, but a lot of the poems, I can even remember the spines of the books on my parents'
Mhm.
bookcases. So early poets that I was really smitten with and didn't quite know what to make of were E. E. Cummings and Langston Hughes and Emily Dickinson and Robert Frost. And
Mhm.
then I think, yeah, as I knew that I loved something that was going on there, the list kept getting bigger and bigger as it does.
Mhm.
I think for me, one of the poets I come back to really frequently is Wisława Szymborska, which is interesting and strange because I'm reading her in translation
Yes.
from the Polish, mostly through Claire Kavanagh, who I think, without knowing Polish, I still think she seems like an amazing translator.
Mm.
But her perspective is something that I just cannot get enough of and
Mhm.
cannot quite mimic, but certainly lean toward. Gerard Manley Hopkins is a poet that I love. I love the music and the percussion and the belief in his poems. I love what he does with images and that there's some puzzling to be done, but it's rewarded. And there's all sorts of contemporary poets that I hope are influencing me too, but it's harder to tell what's going on in the present than it is
Mhm.
kind of looking back at the past.
Yes. I think we have time for This World is Made for Joy.
All right. This world is made for joy. No one is denying that of this world, we have made a million joyless things: landfills, bump stocks, cast, in row, plastic gristle, in children, lead, in case, the suicide note. How is it, then, that we tarry on this side of the ultimatum, unready to depart this cruel world made for joy? Well, there's this. Sometimes when we say in case, what we mean is that we are bluffing on the strength of the bees who stuff their leg warmers with gold dust. And sometimes when we say hope, we mean small fry, herring just hatched, an effervescing pond. My claim on joy is this. Once a pediatrician asked my son if it was his middle name. So when I say this world, I mean wonders, and I mean signs taken for wonders, all of it. I mean the grocer who wagged a wet pom pom of cilantro at us like it was hyssop. You can't tell me that water wasn't holy, as the water is holy when a man not unused to rain gets caught biking home, not just in rain, but in more than a downpour, when his mild epithets turn to whooping on his tongue. Even later, he will not be able to tell it without laughter, without incredulity. He will not say cloudburst or torrent. He will say, the heavens opened. Sometimes they do. Sometimes a child at 3 writes a note in unproven runes and tapes it to the sling where her infant sister bucks. When I say hope, I mean that when their mother asks, the toddler reads the runes, Cordelia, this world is made for joy.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very good reading. I enjoyed that.
Thank
I'll
you.
enjoy listening back to it. Thanks so much for coming on today, Jane Zwart.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about Jane Zwart, go to her website, www.janezwart.com. The next episode will feature poet Alicia Ostreicher. Hope you can join us then.